Years began to take shape not in words or maps, but in wood and sail, hemp and iron. The royal agreement signed in Valladolid gave him the authority to lead Spain's fleet westward in search of the Spice Islands. Now came the reality of turning parchment promises into ships capable of crossing oceans never crossed before. It was the winter of 1518. The air was cool and damp, and the scent of fresh sawdust lingered in the river winds. As men hammered beams and tarred holes under the grey sky, the Armada de Molucca was being borne quietly, steadily. Like a tide coming in, the fleet would consist of 5 ships, chosen for their seaworthiness and maneuverability, though none were truly built for such an extraordinary journey. The flagship would be the Trinidad, sturdy and broad, and Magellan's own command. Then there was the San Antonio, the largest ship in the fleet, heavy with supplies and secrets. The Concepcion and Victoria would follow similar, more agile. And finally, the Santiago, the smallest of all, to be used for scouting ahead. These vessels were not grand galleons, but modest merchant ships and caravels, adapted for a journey few believed would succeed. They were reinforced, refitted, and prepared with every known precaution, but still they creaked like old bones, and groaned when the wind leaned against their rigging. They were not perfect, but they were all Magellan had dot as the ships were outfitted. The call went out across Spain and beyond. Sailors, gunners, carpenters, cooks, interpreters, and soldiers were needed. They came from many walks of life. Some were veterans of the Indies, others were boys who had never seen the sea. There were men from Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, Greece, even North Africa, human mosaic stitched together by the promise of fortune, adventure, or simply escape. Among them was a Venetian scholar named Antonio, who would keep a meticulous journal of the voyage. He was curious and observant, and his words would become our window into this expedition centuries later. Another key figure was Juan de Cal, a Spanish nobleman placed in the fleet by the royal court to watch over Magellan, ostensibly his subordinate. But with ambitions and pride of his own, Magellan, though now sailing under the Spanish flag, remained Portuguese. This detail mattered deeply to the men beneath him, particularly the Spanish officers, who bristled at the idea of taking orders from a foreigner. Many whispered their doubts: could he be trusted? Was he serving Spain's interests or his own? Even before they left port, tension brewed. Cartagena, in particular, grew increasingly confrontational. He questioned orders, resisted Magellan's authority, and fueled quiet dissent among the officers. The seeds of mutiny were already in the soil, but Magellan was calm. He observed without reacting, commanding not with fire but with ice. His authority would be tested in time, but for now he focused on readiness. The supply lists were long, and grimly practical: salted beef, hardtack biscuits, dried beans, garlic, oil, vinegar, wine, and fresh water stored in wooden barrels, nails, pitch, spare sails, ropes, and weapons were loaded care for licorice boughs and arquebuses, swords and cannonballs. They packed trade goods to beads, mirrors, colored cloth, and balsample items to exchange with indigenous peoples. Along the way, but even with all this preparation, The men would face hardship, the food would spoil, the water would sour, diseases would creep aboard in silence. Still, the barrels were sealed, the decks were loaded, and the anchors prepared to rise. As the departure neared, Magellan and his officers gathered in a quiet chapel for a final blessing. Candles flickered in the stone halls, casting long shadows on the floor. Latin prayers rose slowly into the vaulted ceiling, asking for guidance, safety, and strength. Families came to say good bueves, children, and lovers standing at the edge of the docks, their faces lit by torchlight and heavy with unspoken fear. Some sailors left behind debts, others left behind dreams. All knew the voyage might mean death, but it might also mean history. In August 1519, the fleet moved slowly down the Guadalquivir River from Seville toward the Atlantic port of Sancar de Barrameda. The journey downriver took days, winding past farms, watch, and the low cries of gulls. The ships floated like ghosts, their sails furled, their decks humming with quiet labor. Once they reached the mouth of the river, the sea lay ahead, wide and wild, waiting. Once the fleet departed the Canaries and turned westward across the Atlantic, the atmosphere shifted. The winds were favorable, but the mood aboard the ships was not. The voyage would last far longer than any ordinary crossing to the New World. Whispers spread among the crew. Were they heading too far south? Was Magellan leading them astray? Did he truly know where he was going? Some officers resented his quiet manner, interpreting it as arrogance. Others doubted his maps, which showed a strait through South America that no man had yet seen. And below decks, the common sailors began to murmur their own doubts. Life aboard the ships was harsh and repetitive. The men slept in hammocks or on bare planks, woke before dawn, and toiled in tight quarters. Meals were basic and dwindling hardtack biscuits filled with worms. Salted meat gone tough and briny, sometimes water already turning stale. Scurvy, though not yet named, crept in quietly. Loosening teeth and dimming eyes, each ship became its own small society. Some men sang to pass the time, others gambled or carved tokens of wood. Many stared silently at the sea, dreaming of warm coasts or distant families. And always the ocean rolled beneath. Indifferent, Magellan maintained a careful calm. He spent long hours at his charts, plotting stars and cross-referencing coastal features. He said little but saw everything. Though small in stature, he carried himself with quiet certainty. He did not drink heavily, did not laugh idly, and rarely explained himself to the other captains. This only deepened the tension, but he understood what they did. Not the ocean was not merely a path, it was a test. Of patience, of belief, of resolve, instead of sailing directly west to the Caribbean, as many expected. Magellan steered the fleet further, south hugging the coast of Africa before turning toward Brazil. This deviation alarmed some of his officers. Cartagena and others questioned the plan, implying he was lost or deceiving them. But Magellan was searching for something, the mouth of a hidden passage. He believed a strait must cut through the base of South America, linking the Atlantic to the unknown ocean beyond. He would not stop until he found it. After many weeks at sea, the coastline of South America appeared on the horizon green wild, and unfamiliar, the ships approached cautiously. They anchored near the coast of present-day Brazil, taking time to rest and resupply. The locals who approached the ships were friendly, offering food and ornaments in exchange for trinkets. It was a moment of relief. But it was fleeting. The journey south would soon become colder, harsher, and far more dangerous as the ships traced the South American coast southward. A quiet dread settled over the men. The weather grew colder, the seas are rougher. The coastline became less welcoming, more rugged, but still Magellan pressed on, eyes always searching for the shape of a strait that might not exist. Mutiny was no longer just a whisper. It had found a voice. The voyage was entering its next phasing with it. A darker chapter in the journey as summer waned in the southern hemisphere. Magellan's ships hugged the edge of South America, skimming past vast stretches of untamed coast. The green warmth of Brazil had long since disappeared behind them. Now the air grew colder with each passing league. The ocean swelled with long, slow waves, and the land turned barren low cliffs, wind-blasted grasses, and skies thick with clouds. There were no ports, no maps to guide them, only the hard pulse of the wind and the call of the unknown. Magellan believed a straitened opening in the land must exist, a passage to the western sea, but each bay he entered ended in disappointment. Rocky inlets, shallow mud, winding rivers that died inland. The strait remained elusive. By March of 1520, after nearly 6 months at sea, the fleet reached a stretch of coastline that would later be known as Patagonia. The name, Pigafetta wrote, came from the strange, tall natives they glimpsed onshore people the Europeans called Patagonians. Though the accounts were likely exaggerated, it added to the region's air of mystery. The land was lonely, windswept, and cold. There was no safe harbor, but there was no turning back. Magellan decided the fleet would winter here, anchoring in a natural bay they named Puerto San Julian. There, under grey skies and biting wind, the ships dropped anchor. Sails were furled, and fires were lit on deck for warmth. The men built crude shelters from spare timber, and slept in their heavy wool cloaks. The nights were bitter. Ice formed on the ropes. Snow fell on the decks. Food grew scarce. Water turned brackish. The days dragged into a frozen sameness, and in the cold silence, old doubts awoke. Captain Wanda. Cartagena had never accepted Magellan's authority. He had been planted on this voyage as a political counterweight, and no hundreds of miles from the nearest port saw his chance, along with 2 other captains, Gaspar de Quesada of the Concepcion and Luis de Mendoza of the Victoria. Cartagena began to plot. They accused Magellan of cruelty, secrecy, and leading the fleet to ruin. That he was Portuguese, they said, meant he could not be trusted, that he had taken them too far, into lands too cold, too remote, too dangerous. Whispers turned to murmurs. Murmurs turned to plans. In the dead of night, as snow dusted the decks, Cartagena and his allies seized control of 3 of the 5 ships, the San Antonio and the Victoria. Their men overpowered the loyalists aboard, locking away officers who remained loyal to Magellan. They sent a message to the Trinidad, demanding that Magellan resign his command and return to Spain. The mutiny was no longer hidden, it was open. An absolute dot, but Magellan did not yield. Rather than attack in haste, Magellan used cunning. He pretended to negotiate, sending emissaries under the pretext of parley. But the men he sent were loyal and well armed. On the Victoria, they overpowered the mutineers and retook the ship, with one vessel back under his control. Magellan acted swiftly. He maneuvered the Trinidad and Victoria to block the harbour mouth, trapping the remaining rebel ships. Then, with calculated force, he moved on the Concepcion and the San Antonio. The mutiny was crushed. Magellan dealt with the rebels swiftly, and with chilling precision. Quesada was beheaded. Mendoza was stabbed to death by one of Magellan's men. As for the captain who had defied him from the beginning, Magellan chose a quieter punishment. He marooned him on a cold, lonely shore. Cartagena and a priest who had supported him were left with a small supply of food and abandoned. Their fates were never recorded. They vanished into the silence of Patagonia. The mutiny had failed, but it left scars. Magellan's authority was now unquestioned, but the fleet had been fractured. Trust was hard to rebuild. The cold continued. The Strait had still not been found. Yet Magellan's resolve did not waver. He reorganized the fleet, reassigned officers, and kept watch over those who remained. Though the sea had not yet claimed them, it was clear that man was the greater danger. As the final snows of winter melted into spring, the wind shifted and the land softened. Seals and penguins reappeared on the beaches. The ships, frostbitten but intact, ready to sail again, Magellan stood once more at the helm of his fleet. Not by title alone, but by will. He had stared down betrayal and held his course. But still, the Strait remained hidden, the key to the Pacific, the path to the Spice Islands, the answer to everything Thee had not yet found. But it was close, and in the next chapter, the sea would reveal its secret. With winter's grip loosening, and the mutiny quelled, the fleet weighed anchor once more in early August 1520, their sails rising against a dull, grey sky. Cold winds pressed at their backs as they continued the journey south, each ship moving cautiously along the ragged edge of the continent. The landscape was like none they had seen before: towering cliffs crowned with snow, glaciers that shimmered in the distance, and a coast that twisted and broke into inlets like the fingers of an unseen hand. For weeks, Magellan's gaze was fixed on the horizon. Somewhere, hidden in this raw and unforgiving wilderness, lay the strait he believed must exist. It was the key to the Pacific path that would carry them west toward the Spice Islands, and vindicate everything he had sacrificed. On October 21st, 1520, the lookout atop the Trinidad's mast shouted. Ahead lay a vast, winding inlet, deeper and broader than any they had yet explored. Cautiously, the fleet entered the channel, sails furled to half-mast as they moved between rocky headlands. The entrance was marked by steep hills and snow-capped peaks. There was no smoke from native fires, no cities, just the sound of the wind howling between stone. For weeks, they explored the twisting passage, sending the Santiago ahead to scout narrow arms of the channel. At times, the strait widened into great bays, and then narrowed again into fjord-like corridors with cliffs rising on either side. The waters were treacherous, filed with shifting currents, rocks hidden beneath the surface, and the ghostly shapes of drifting ice. Still they pressed on. It was during one of these forays that the Santiago, the smallest and lightest ship, was lost. Driven ashore by a sudden squall, she splintered on the rocks. Though her crew survived and returned to the main fleet by foot overland, it was a bitter loss. 1/5 of the fleet gone in a single breath of wind. Magellan did not stop. He divided the remaining ships and continued through the channel. He knew the world was not yet done testing him, but each bend in the strait brought hope, each opening a flicker of what might be beyond dot. Then, on November 28th, after more than a month navigating the winding, icy channel, the sea changed. The color of the water shifted from dark green to deep sapphire. The current grew gentler, more rhythmic, like the breathing of a vast animal. Ahead stretched an endless expanse of open ocean, calm, clear, and shockingly serene. Magellan had found it. He had sailed westward from Europe, down the spine of a continent, and through a hidden strait, and now he stood at the edge of another sea no European had crossed. Mapped, or even named, the ocean before them glittered under the pale southern sun. The waves, which had so tormented them in the Atlantic, seemed here to sleep. The sky was wide and unbroken, its silence echoed by the steady rhythm of the ship's creaking timbers. In this moment of peace, Magellan gave the new ocean its name, Mar Pacvicathorth. See. It was not a name born of its true nature, for this ocean could be as cruel as any other. But in that moment, after months of hardship, death, rebellion, and ice, it felt like mercy. The men gave thanks. Some wept openly. Others knelt on deck in prayer. What Magellan had accomplished was staggering. He had discovered a passage that connected the Atlantic to the Pacific, secret door through the bones of a continent. Though the indigenous peoples of South America had lived alongside this waterway for millennia, to the European world it was entirely new. The strait would later bear Magellan's name, a permanent thread stitched into the map of the earth. It was more than just a passage, it was proof that the globe could be circled by sea, that east and west were not separate realms, but two halves of a single navigable world. But even as the fleet slipped gently into the Pacific, a quiet dread lingered. They had reached a new ocean, yes, but it was vast, uncharted, and utterly indifferent to their triumph. The men did not know what lay ahead, how far the Spice Islands were, or how long the journey would take. They had found a way through, but at what cost? Winter had taken one ship. Mutiny had nearly claimed the fleet. Supplies were low, morale was brittle, and now they faced the greatest expanse of open water ever attempted by European sailors. Still, Magellan gave the order westward, so they sailed into the unknown, the wind curling softly through the ropes, the Pacific stretching endlessly before them. Behind lay the straighter winding glacial corridor of triumph and grief. Ahead was a sea that had no map, no end in sight, only a sun-soaked silence, and a direction that promised destiny. Magellan stood at the bow, one hand on the rail, eyes steady on the horizon. he had found the way through the land. Now he would cross the world itself, and in the next chapter, that ocean so peaceful in name-willed, test them in ways they could not. Yet imagine, the ships entered the Pacific Ocean in late November of 1520, sails catching the warm, steady wind as they slipped gently into a new world. The straits of southern Patagonia faded behind them, swallowed by the mists, and jagged coastlines of that lonely southern edge of the earth. Before them stretched water-nothing but water-flat and luminous, a vast mirror for the sky. At first the men rejoiced. The sea was calm, the weather fair, dolphins danced alongside the ships, flying fish scattered in shimmering arcs across the waves. The sails hung full and content, and the air was warmer than it had been in months. It seemed a reward for all they had endured, but the sea, as always, was keeping its secrets. Days passed, then weeks, then months. The fleet sailed westward with the sun, deeper into the Pacific than any European ship had gone. No storms harassed them, no pirates appeared, but neither did land. No coastlines, no islands, no fresh food or water. Only the same endless horizon, unchanged each morning, each evening. The sea might have been peaceful in name, but it was vast beyond reckoning. Soon the silence itself became oppressive. The men grew weary of the sameness, never-ending stretch of blue. They had expected a short crossing to the Spice Islands. Instead, they found themselves in an ocean wider than any they had imagined, with no map, no known landmarks, and no reassurance that they were on the right course. By January, their food began to spoil. The hardtack, already infested with worms, crumbled into black dust and mold. The salted meat, packed in brine, had long turned rancid. The wine, stored in wooden barrels, soured and stung the tongue. They began to boil sawdust from wooden planks to flavor water. Even the rats aboard the ships, normally a nuisance, became a source of desperate sustenance. Rats were hunted, caught and sold for half a ducat apiece. Sailors sucked on leather belts. Shoes, pieces of harness, boiled until soft and chewed for hours. Some dug at crumbs in the seams of crates. Others simply sat and stared at the waves, their eyes hollow with hunger. Then came scurvy. Their gums swelled and bled. Teeth loosened and fell. Legs stiffened and bruised with no touch. Skin turned waxy. The men moved like shadows across the decks. Slower with each day, they cried out in their sleep. Some lay below deck and never rose again. Over 30 men would die during the crossing off starvation. Of disease, of despair. There were no storms, no battles, no wrecks, just a slow, quiet wasting of the body. The greatest danger was not the ocean's rageite, was its indifference. Magellan remained composed. He said little, but his presence gave shape to the days. He studied the sun and stars, cross-referenced with charts, adjusted the fleet's heading when needed. He never expressed doubt aloud. He never showed despair. In his silence was strength. He kept order aboard the Trinidad, rationed what food remained, and maintained discipline when men argued or broke under pressure. Some historians would later say he was cold, others that he was the only reason the fleet survived. He knew the world was round, knew that land had to come, but he also knew that belief could not feed the dying dot. In mid-February, the lookout cried outland on the horizon. A small island, lush and green. The men shouted with joy, some weeping, others dropping to their knees in prayer. But as they approached, the islanders fled, setting their huts ablaze before vanishing into the trees. The sailors searched in vain for food, for fruit, for animals. There was nothing left. The fires had taken it all. The men returned to the ship's hollow, and quiet they named the island Isla de los Ladrones, Eland of thieves. After the locals attempted to take a longboat and supplies. It was the first sign of conflict, but the deepest sting came from disappointment. The land had not saved them. They sailed on. Finally, after 3 months and 20 days at sea on March 6, 1521, they reached the Mariana Islands, a group of verdant, volcanic islands in the western Pacific. There they were able to drop anchor, wade ashore, and for the first time in months eat fresh fruit, drink clean water, and feel grass beneath their feet. The relief was overwhelming. Survivors trembled as they chewed bananas. They slept under palm trees with full bellies. They sang softly at night. They had crossed the Pacific, a feat never before accomplished by any European. They had traveled more than 600 miles across the Pacific, from the tip of South America to the islands near modern-day Philippines. No storms had torn their sails. No enemy had sunk their ships. But the ocean had nearly claimed them all the same. 3 ships remained Trinidad, Victoria, and Concepcion. The men were gaunt, sunken, their clothing in tatters. And yet some worthy had done what no fleet in history had done before Magellan had crossed the world. As the ships floated peacefully in the harbor, anchored at last after months of drifting and dying, the sky faded to a dusky violet. Palm leaves rustled. The air was warm. Men wept quietly for friends lost. Others traced crosses over their chests and stared upward, wondering how the stars could still shine. The Pacific had been peaceful in name only, but from that endless silence they had emerged not unchanged but undefeated on the next chapter. New islands appear on the horizon. So do new people, and in time new dangers. Magellan's fate will soon be sealed not by sea, but by sword. After the starving silence of the Pacific, the islands of Southeast Asia appeared like an impossible dream. Thick jungles pressed against white shores, palm trees swayed in warm winds. Birds flashed like fire through the canopy, and beneath it all, the scent of fruit and smoke and life. The men could hardly believe it. In March 1521, after months at sea, the fleet arrived at Harmonhan, a small island in the eastern Philippines. It was uninhabited, but soon local boats appeared to trigger canoes with sails of woven fiber, paddled by curious, cautious islanders who offered coconuts, bananas, and rice in exchange for beads and cloth. The sailors welcomed them as angels. Food was shared, gifts were exchanged. For the first time in many months, there was music, laughter, peace. Magellan, now restored in strength and vision, saw more than just rest and recovery in these islands. He saw opportunity. Not only could they resupply, but here, In this archipelago, unknown to European powers, he could extend the reach of Spain through alliance, trade, and, importantly, conversion, for Magellan was a deeply devout Catholic. And just as he had dreamed of circling the earth, he had also long believed it his duty to bring Christianity to distant lands. Now, standing in these humid forests beneath the Southern Cross, he would pursue both Lagos and salvation, sailing west through the islands. The fleet reached Cebu, a large and powerful island governed by a local ruler named Roger. Here, the Spanish were received with respect. Gifts were exchanged. An interpreter, Enrique of Malacca, a Malay-speaking slave Magellan had, brought from earlier travels, helped establish dialogue. The Raja was impressed by the Spanish firearms, armor, and ships. But more than that, he was intrigued by the idea of alliance through religion. In a grand ceremony on the beach, with drums and torches, Humabon converted to Christianity, taking the name Carlos. In honor of the Spanish king, his queen followed. As did hundreds of his subjects, Magellan was elated. He had not only opened a new passage across the world, had brought the cross to new shores, but the Philippines, though welcoming, were not unified. The islands were a patchwork of tribes and rulers, some of whom were rivals, even enemies. Raja Humabon ruled Cebu, but his authority did not extend to all nearby chieftains. One such leader was Lapu-Lapu, the Datu of Mactan Island, strong, independent, and unwilling to submit to any foreign power. No matter how grand, Magellan, feeling emboldened by recent success, saw Lapu-Lapu's resistance not as a local dispute, but as a challenge to Spanish authority and the Christian God. He believed that a show of strength and decisive would bring the island into the fold. It would be his final decision on the night of April 26, 1521. Magellan prepared a strike force to sail across the narrow strait to Mactan. He brought around 60 armed men, wearing breastplates and helmets, carrying crossbows, swords, and muskets. He expected a small skirmishing opportunity to display European firepower, establish dominance, and return triumphant to Humabon. He refused to bring reinforcements from the other ships. He wanted the glory and the example to be his alone. They landed before dawn. The tide was low, forcing the men to wade through sharp coral reefs and shallow water, slowing them and separating them from their boats on the beach ahead. Lapu-Lapu's warriors were waiting. It was not a battle-light, was a disaster. The warriors of Mactan numbered in the hundreds. They fought with bamboo spears, fire-hardened sticks, and poison arrows. But they fought on their land, in their waters, under their sky. They moved with agility. They struck from behind palm trees and driftwood barricades. The Spanish muskets, powerful but slow to reload, were almost useless at such close range. The armor, so effective in European combat, weighed the men down in the heat and shallow surf. The coral cut their feet. The sun blinded their eyes. Magellan fought bravely, sword in hand, urging his men to stand, but he was struck by a poisoned arrow to the leg, then another to the arm, then a spear. He fell in the surf, blood mingling with salt and sand as his men fled to the boats. Magellan remained behind, shielding their retreat. His armor rusted with seawater. His lungs heaved. He fought until he could no longer stand. Lapula Pass warriors closed in, there, on a beach of crushed shells and morning fire. Ferdinand Magellan was killed not by sea, nor storm, nor mutiny, but by the people of an island he had never intended to conquer. He was about 41 years old. His body was never recovered. Only 2 ships, the Victoria and Trinidad, escaped. The Conception, too damaged and undermanned, was burned. The Voyage had lost its captain, its fleet, and most of its crew, and yet it sailed on. Magellan's life ended far from the home he had known, a shore without monuments, without flags, under a foreign sun. He never saw the Spice Islands, never returned to Spain, never knew that the earth he circled would one day bear his name in oceans and straits, in textbooks and memory, but in death his voyage lived on. The dream he had pursued across oceans, through mutiny, and past monsters of doubt had not died with him, and in the next chapter we follow the crew, that remembers ragged survivors who would carry his vision home, and, in doing so, complete the first circumnavigation of the globe, when the sun rose after the battle at the ocean looked the same, but everything had changed. Ferdinand Magellan was Genethi visionary, the architect of the voyage, the captain general who had led them across 2 oceans. In his absence, the remaining crew drifted in silence, leaderless and uncertain. 3 ships remained, the Trinidad, the Victoria, and the Conception. Of the original 270 men, more than half were dead. Some had starved, others had fallen to scurvy. Many had perished in the ambush in sea. Those who remained were hollowed by grief, but also hardened survivors of a journey no one had imagined would go this far. Magellan's voyage was not over, and now it would become something else, a test of endurance, wit, and sheer willpower. The survivors met in council aboard the ships. Someone had to take command. Several names were discussed of experience, of authority, but ultimately they settled on Juan Sebastian Elk, a Basque sailor who had served loyally throughout the expedition. He was not noble, not well-born, but he was steady, calm under pressure, and respected by the men. Elcan did not seek glory. He sought survival. Under his command, the fleet reorganized. Their goal was now clear: reach the Spice Islands, trade for precious cloves and nutmeg, then return to Spain by any means possible. But first, they had to escape the Philippines. Of the 3 ships that remained, the Conception was the weakest, damaged, leaking, short of crew. A decision was made to scuttle her. In a solemn moment, the men set fire to their own vessel, watching as its timbers cracked and smoke billowed into the island sky. It was a practical choice, but one that left a scar. That ship had carried them across the Atlantic. It had survived mutiny, storms, and hunger. Now it was gone. Only 2 ships remained, the Victoria and the Trinidad. For weeks, the ships sailed through the Indonesian archipelago, weaving between hundreds of islands, some no larger than a field, others with mountains that rose into the clouds. The weather was hot and thick with moisture. The sea steamed. The sails sagged in the stillness. Finally, in November 1521, after more than 2 years at sea, the fleet reached Tidor, one of the famed Spice Islands' very destination Magellan had envisioned. When he first sailed from Spain. Here, they were welcomed by the Sultan, who saw in the Europeans a valuable alliance against Portuguese encroachment. Gifts were exchanged, a treaty was signed, cloves worth, their weight in goldware, loaded by the ton, into the ship's holds. It was a moment of triumph, quiet and delayed, but real. But the men were now faced with a crucial decision: how to return home. To the west lay the Indian Ocean, and the Portuguese colonies of Goa and Mozambique territories hostile to Spanish ships. To the east lay the Pacific, same endless sea. They had barely survived the first time. After much debate, the decision was made to split the ships. The Trinidad, now captained by Gonzalo Giames de Espinosa, would attempt to return east across the Pacific. Retracing their original path, the Victoria under El would take the more dangerous but shorter route westward, crossing the Indian Ocean, rounding the southern tip of Africa, and sailing up the Atlantic back to Spain. Both were dangerous, but staying was not an option. The Trinidad, battered and undermanned, departed first, but the voyage east would prove impossible. Struggling against fierce headwinds and constant storms, the ship was soon crippled by leaks and sickness. The men suffered as they had on the Pacific: scurvy, starvation, despair, unable to continue. The Trinidad limped back to the Spice Islands, where it was captured by the Portuguese. Its crew was imprisoned. Some were tortured. Many died. Only a handful would ever see Europe again. For the Trinidad, the voyage had ended in silence. Meanwhile, the Victoria departed quietly on December 21st, 1521, under the command of Juan Sebastian Elcano. Her hull was full of cloves and unimaginable fortune. Her sails were patched. Her crew just 47 Europeans, many too weak to stand. The ship moved westward into the Indian Ocean. Guided by the monsoon winds, they sailed alone. No escorts, no reinforcements, just a single, scarred vessel threading its way through enemy waters. They avoided the Portuguese whenever possible, stuck to open seas, navigated by the stars. In May of 1522, the Victoria reached the Cape of Good Hope, storm-lashed promontory at the southern tip of Africa. Long feared and famed among sailors, the seas here were wild. The wind howled like a beast. Waves slammed the ship from both sides. The Victoria almost did not survive, but inch by inch she clawed her way northward, following the coast of Africa, staying far enough out to sea to avoid Portuguese patrols. By July, she had crossed into the Atlantic. The ocean that had carried them away now welcomed them home, and so, alone, quiet and tattered, the Victoria sailed on. One ship, one crew, one world behind them. They had seen lands no Spaniard had known, endured seas no map had charted, lost their captain, their comrades, their strength. But they had survived. In the next chapter, they will reach home, and in doing so, they will complete a circle around the earth, something no human beings had ever done before. On a quiet September morning in 1522, the people of Sanlúcar de Barrameda, a sleepy port on the southern coast of Spain, looked out across the bay and saw something small on the horizon. It was not a fleet, not a parade of sails, just a single dark ship. Its canvas patchy and stained, its hull low in the water. Moving slowly with the tide. It was the Victoria. 3 years had passed since the 5 proud ships of the Armada de Molucca had departed from this very place, their sails bright with purpose. Now only this one remained, a floating skeleton of its former self, blackened by sun, by salt, and by time. She was weathered, crooked, and hollow. But she had come home. The Victoria anchored slowly at the quay. Its remaining 18 European survivors, weak too, stand clinging to the railings. Of the original 270 men who had embarked under Magellan's command, fewer than 1 in 10 had survived the full journey. Some could barely walk. Others were gaunt, their skin drawn tight over their bones, their clothes little more than rags. They descended the gangplank in silence, the wind catching the fringe of their torn sleeves. The town watched in awe. They had circled the earth from south. The crew made their way upriver to Seville, the beating heart of Spain's maritime empire. They were received with quiet reverence. The authorities took possession of the ship, along with her precious cargo, 26 tons of cloves and nutmeg, enough to cover the entire cost of the expedition. And then some. Word spread quickly. Priests rang bells in the cathedral. Sailors lit candles in the churches. The people whispered the same phrase again. And again they have returned from the ends of the earth. At the head of the survivors stood Juan Sebastian Elcano, the quiet Basque sailor who had taken command after Magellan's death. When the king summoned him to court, Elcano brought with him a globular small sphere marked with ink and thread, tracing the path they had taken around the world, kneeling before King Charles I. He said, "Only your Majesty, we have sailed around the entire world, and by your grace we have returned." The king awarded Elcano a coat of arms, bearing the Latin words Primus Circumdidesti, me you were the first to circle me, that the implications of the voyage were profound. Until then, maps of the world had been patchworks of speculation, continents misplaced, oceans unknown. But now, for the first time in human history, it had been proven the world was round, continuous, and connected by sea. The Pacific Ocean, once only rumor, had been crossed. The globe, once a mystery, had been circled. Even if the men could not explain longitude or wind patterns, or celestial navigation to those gathered in the taverns of Seville, one truth was now known by all the earth could be touched in full, and it had been done by sail, and by will. The Victoria herself became an icon. She had survived tempests, scurvy, mutiny, starvation, and war. She had carried men farther than any ship before her, across every meridian, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, across the Indian Ocean and back again. In a sense, she was more than a ship. She was the final witness, the last remaining voice of the fleet that had once set out under Magellan's proud command. Later, when her cargo was unloaded and her lines were finally cut, she was retired and displayed as a relic, a body laid to rest. But even as the survivors were celebrated, their joy was tempered by memory. Ferdinand Magellan, who had made it all possible, was gone. So were nearly all of his officers. his friends, and his shipmates. Their names would be carved into the scrolls of history only faintly. There were no funerals for the men who vanished in the Pacific, nor for those who had wasted away in the Spice Islands, or died on the sharp reefs of Mecton, but in the minds of those who remained. They were never forgotten. The Venetian chronicler, who had kept notes throughout the voyage, would later write, "Of all that we lost, only memory remains." In Lisbon, the Portuguese court received the news with mixed emotion. Their rival, Spain, had succeeded in something Portugal had always sought, a maritime route to the Spice Islands from the west. Though the Portuguese still controlled much of the East Indies, the symbolic victory belonged to Spain. In the years that followed, disputes over sovereignty in the Pacific would deepen. Treaties would be rewritten, charts redrawn, and empires reimagined. The world would never be the same again. And so, the voyage ended not in drums and banners, but in quiet awe, a battered ship, a gaunt crew, a story almost too vast to comprehend. They had left as explorers, they returned as proof. In the next section, we will step back to reflect on Magellan himself, not only as a navigator, but as a man. What drove him? What haunted him? And how did he come to shape the world more through his death than through his life? History often remembers the loud, the proud, the celebrated, but Ferdinand Magellan, for all the grandeur of his voyage, was never one for spectacle. He was not a charismatic speaker. He did not charm courts or bask in glory. He preferred maps to mirrors, stars to applause. He was a man of calculation, of silence, and of storms carried within to understand the journey. One must first understand the man who dared to draw its line across the globinet, just the captain, but the boy from the exile from Portugal, and the servant of a dream that would cost him his life. Born around 1480 in the small, rugged town of Sabrosa, Portugal, Magellan grew up far from the royal court, but close to its ambitions. His family held minor nobility enough to send young Ferdinand to court as a page, where he would study navigation, astronomy, and the art of command. But even as a boy, he was shaped by two conflicting forces, structure and wonder. He learned the rules of empire, but his eyes drifted often to the sea. He read of Marco Polo, of mysterious islands to the east, of spices that could make kings rich, and ships eternal. The oceans were not yet fully known, and he wanted to be among the first to know them. In his 20s, Magellan sailed with Portuguese fleets to India and Malacca, gaining first-hand experience in long-distance navigation, conflict, and trade. He learned the monsoon winds. He learned the coastline of Africa. He learned what hunger and tropical disease could do to the human body and to the human soul. But his career with Portugal ended in disillusionment. Accused of illegal trading and stripped of royal favour, Magellan left Lisbon in 1517, not in disgrace, but in defiance. It was then, with quiet fire in his chest, that he turned to Spain, a man without a country, a man with a plan. Magellan was deeply religious, not performatively so, but sincerely. He carried a rosary, spoke often of divine destiny, and saw his mission as more than political. To him, discovering a new route to the east was not just an act of exploration, but an act of faith. a way to bring Christian light to the furthest reaches of darkness, but his devotion carried a darker twin rigidity. He was intolerant of dissent, unforgiving of disobedience. His men both respected and feared him. He demanded discipline. Even in desperation, it won him success, but it cost him love by serving Spain. Magellan became a man without a flag, Portuguese by birth, but mistrusted by his homeland, Spanish by loyalty, but never truly embraced. Among the officers on his voyage, especially the Spaniards, he was seen as an outsider interloper with too much power. Yet, this outsider status may have been what made him so bold, free from allegiance. He answered only to the sea, and to the shape of the world in his mind he believed he could redraw the map. And in many ways he did. Magellan rarely raised his voice. He led by precision, by presence, and by unbending will. He knew the calculations of wind and latitude better than most men of his age. He made his officers learn celestial navigation. He punished mutiny harshly, but spared where he could. He rewarded loyalty, but never begged for it. He was not beloved, but he was followed in his stillness. He seemed to see something others didn't, that the earth was not a battlefield, but a sphere, that it could be measured, travelled, embraced. What made Magellan extraordinary was not just his ability to sail about his imagination. He saw a connection across the oceans long before any man could prove it. He believed in the Strait before it was discovered. He trusted that west could reach east, even when the maps said otherwise. His was a vision so large, it outlived him in the end. He died on a small island in a skirmish he could have avoided, and yet his name would circle the globe. His death, seemingly meaningless in the moment, became the pivot point of a voyage that would define an age. Today, Ferdinand Magellan is remembered in many ways. His name graces straits, ships, satellites, and even galaxies. He is both praised and criticized, an explorer to some, a colonizer to others. A visionary, yes, but also a man of empire, whose voyage paved the way for conquest as well as connection. He remains one of history's paradoxes, a man who changed the world, but never saw it change. He was driven by God, by ambition, by wounded pride, but also by a quiet, stubborn belief that the world was round, and that he could prove it by sailing until the sea circled back upon itself. Tonight, as you lie quietly listening, picture the man himself, not in armor, not at war, but alone on the deck of the Trinidad, eyes to the stars. The sea is still, the sails whisper, and beneath the sky he traces the heavens with his fingers, knowing he will not see the journey's end. But trusting in the course, he did not return, but because of him, the world was returned to itself. In the next section, well, look at what this voyage truly meant, not just in Magellan's time, but for centuries after, how it changed the maps, the minds, and the momentum of human history. In the silence after the Victoria returned to Spain, something remarkable began to happen. Maps were redrawn. The shape of continents changed. The edges of oceans became clearer. Their distances measured not in guesses, but in leagues survived, storms weathered, and stars followed before Magellan's voyage. The world was a patchwork of speculation, a canvas of mystery. After it, that canvas became a globe, not fully known, not fully charted, but proven to be whole, connected, circumnavigable. A theory became a fact, and with that, the age of exploration entered a new chapter shaped by certainty, though Magellan did not live to complete it. The voyage he began marked the first circumnavigation of Earth in human history. It was more than a nautical feat, it was a conceptual revolution. It was now clear that the Earth could be travelled continuously, that east could become west, that oceans connected rather than divided. This realization opened not only trade routes, but intellectual frontiers. It confirmed centuries of speculation by Greek astronomers, Arab geographers, and Renaissance thinkers, philosophers, scientists, and priests now had to reconcile with a world that could be touched in full. The journey also had profound economic consequences. The cargo of cloves and nutmeg brought back by the Victoria was worth more than the entire cost of the expedition. It proved that spice-light, fragrant, and easy to transport could finance empires. Soon after, the race to reach the East Indies intensified. Both Spain and Portugal launched more expeditions. The Dutch and English would follow. Trade routes spiderwebbed across the oceans, forming the early threads of a global economy. Magellan's voyage had shown that wealth could be pursued not just by crossing borders, by crossing oceans. Before the voyage, the Pacific Ocean was a rumor. After, it became a gateway. The sea that Magellan named Pacificus for was revealed to be vast and central. It was no longer a void between coasts, but a bridge connecting Asia, the Americas, and beyond. In time, galleons would sail regularly between Mexico and the Philippines, forming the Manila-Acapulco trade route, one of the earliest transoceanic links between East and West. Silver flowed east, spices, silk, and porcelain flowed west. Magellan's route became more than a path. It became a pattern. For navigators, the expedition was a crucible of discovery. They learned how to read the sky more accurately, how to navigate using longitude estimates and seasonal winds. They learned the danger of scurvy, the importance of food preservation, and the behaviors of equatorial currents. Even the concept of time changed. Sailors aboard the Victoria were shocked to learn, upon their return, that they had lost a day, though they had kept faithful records. The turning of the earth had outpaced their counting. This was the first practical experience of the international date, linear proof of the planet's rotation, and a tangible symptom of CIRCUM navigation. The voyage also deepened tensions between Spain and Portugal. The Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494, had split the world between them, but it had not anticipated a full circumnavigation when the Victoria returned loaded with cloves. Spain claimed that the Spice Islands lay in their half of the world. Portugal disagreed. Arguments broke out. Papal mediation was requested. Eventually, Spain sold its claim to the Moluccas back to Portugal, but the precedent had been set. The world was too small for isolation. Borders drawn on paper could not contain the tides, and yet, behind the glory and the spice and the maps, lay another Ligocione of suffering, Of the 270 men who had departed, only 18 returned. The others died from starvation, mutiny, disease, or violence. They were buried at sea, left on islands. Forgotten in prison cells, the circumnavigation came at a steep human price, and beyond the crew, there were others affected, indigenous peoples drawn into European conflicts, manipulated, converted, or fought. In the Philippines, where Magellan died, the seeds of colonial tension were planted struggle that would continue for centuries. The voyage made the world feel smaller, but it also made the world more dangerous. Perhaps the most lasting change was not in maps or gold, but in the mind. After Magellan, the idea of the earth as one continuous, navigable system became part of human consciousness. No longer was the sea a barrier, it was a path. No longer were lands isolated, they were accessible. This shift opened the door for scientific exploration, for imperial expansion, and for cultural exchange, both good and ill. The world became knowable, measurable, crossable, and people began to think globally. So tonight, as the waves of time ripple gently across your thoughts, consider the long wake of one voyage, a fleet of wooden ships, a handful of men, a vision drawn in starlight. They sailed not just around continents, but through the fabric of history. Because of them, the oceans grew smaller, the maps more accurate, the world more connected and more complicated. In the next chapter, we return to the survivor stows who, in old age, carried the memory of the voyage like a scar, and those who wrote the story so it would not be lost. After 3 years at sea, after crossing 3 oceans, surviving storms, mutinies, and death, the men who returned aboard the Victoria stepped back into a world that had not changed as they had. The streets of Seville bustled with life, the market stalls teemed with noise, and bells rang in church towers overhead. But for the survivors, everything felt quieter. They had circled the planet. They had stared into the mouth of the unknown. Now, they returned to ordinary life, though ordinary would never feel the same. Some struggled to sleep. Some avoided the sea forever after. Others drifted from port to port, unable to stay still, haunted by the rhythm of waves and the ghosts of lost shipmates. Juan Sebastian, who had brought the Victoria home, was celebrated in the courts of Spain. He was awarded a pension and a coat of arms, but he did not seek fame. He returned to his hometown in the Basque country, where the hills rolled gently, and the sky was close. He rarely spoke of the voyage in detail. He had led men through starvation and despair. He had navigated oceans with no chart. He had buried friends, burned ships, and watched land fall away for months at a time. Though he lived just a few years after his return, his silence was profound, as though speaking of it would somehow unravel it. Among the most important survivors was Antonio P., a Venetian nobleman who had joined the voyage not as a sailor, but as a scholar and observer. He kept meticulous records of weather, stars, islands, people, and events. He drew maps, translated words, and recorded tribal customs more than anyone. It is Pigafetta we thank for knowing what we know. Upon returning, he compiled his notes into a manuscript, travel account of remarkable detail and poetic clarity. In it, he recounted not just dates and places, but the emotions of the voyage, the fear, the wonder, the silence of a sea with no end. His account would become one of the most important documents of the age of exploration. The rest of the crew, just 17 others from the original 270, returned to lives that, in many cases, left no further record. A few may have taken other voyages. Some likely lived in quiet poverty. Others found work in the ports and shipyards of Spain. But all of them carried something no one else could understand: the memory of being first. They had seen the Pacific before anyone in Europe knew its name. They had tasted the water in islands lost to charts. They had watched a man Magellan stand unshaken against the abyss, and fall to it nonetheless. And yet they had come home. To survive such a journey was not simply to live. It was to carry the burden of those who had not. Every night at sea, someone had disappeared. A man quietly buried at dawn, a name scratched into a ledger, a hammock thrown into the ocean. Survivors rarely tell their stories fully, not because they forget, but because they remember too much. Some surely lay awake years later, hearing the creak of wood beneath their feet, or the soft rhythm of waves against a hull that was no longer there. One figure stands at the edge of the narrative, mysterious and unconfirmed: Enrique of Malacca. He was Magellan's personal slave, an interpreter taken during earlier Portuguese voyages in the East. He spoke Malay, Tagalog, and perhaps other regional languages, serving as the bridge between Europeans and islanders throughout the Philippines. After Magellan's death, Enrique disappears from the record. Some historians believe he escaped and lived among the local tribes. If so, he would have become, in an unrecorded way, the first person to circle the globe, starting from Asia, sailing west with Magellan, and then returning to his homeland, a circumnavigation unrecognized by crowns or charts, but no less real. For the survivors, the circumnavigation was not a theory. It was not a feat of science. It was suffering, loss, and disbelief. The world had turned beneath their feet. They had watched the stars shift slowly, night by night. They had seen death in every form the sea could offer, and yet, when they stepped ashore, they had done something unimaginable. Not even they knew how large. That fact would loom in the centuries to follow. Tonight, in your mind's eye, picture one of them, great-haired now, sitting by a window near the harbor, watching young sailors repair a mast. The sun falls quietly on the water. He drinks slowly, lost in thought. When someone asks about the voyage, he smiles faintly. We went west, and came home from the east. No explanation. Just a circle traced quietly in the air, a gesture too large to put into words. In the next chapter, we'll explore the questions Magellan never lived to ask. What came next? What did the voyage set in motion? And how did future explorers follow the path he had drawn into the sea? When the sails of the Victoria were finally furled, and her crew faded into the streets of Seville, the voyage might have seemed over, but it was not. In truth, the journey of Ferdinand Magellan continued not in ships, but in stories, in maps, and in the ambitions of those who followed the route he opened across the oceans. Though costly, was now proven. It had been carved into the sea by salt, suffering, and silent perseverance, and like any path walked once, others would follow it. The map had changed. The world had changed, and human thought about space, distance, empire, and the planet itself would never return to what it had been. The voyage made one truth unavoidable: the Earth was not a series of isolated kingdoms. It was one vast, turning sphere. What happened in the East now affected the West. What lay across the sea was not myth, but fact, a reality reachable by sail. And by will. This shifted the balance of everything. Trade patterns changed. Political strategies were rewritten. Empires that had looked only to their neighbors now cast their gaze across oceans. The concept of global influence, still new and unstable, began to take form, and all of it traced back to a narrow strait, hidden at the edge of the known world, that Magellan had dared to find after the voyage. Spain quickly recognized the potential of a Pacific presence. Although Portugal had long dominated routes around Africa to Asia, Magellan's voyage proved that Spain could reach the same riches by going west. In 1565, Spain would establish a permanent colony in the Philippines, named after Prince Philip, later Philip II. This colony, governed from Manila, became the cornerstone of Spain's Pacific ambitions. Trade flowed east from Mexico, silver in one direction, silk and spices in the other. Magellan had given Spain a reason to look across the sea and a reason to stay there. Magellan's voyage was not the last of its kind. It was the first of many. In the decades that followed, others would attempt to follow in his wake. Sir Francis Drake, the English privateer, famously circumnavigated the globe in the 1570s. This time as both explorer and pirate, raiding Spanish colonies along the way. His journey mirrored Magellan's in scope. If not in purpose, later came James Cook, who explored the Pacific more deeply, charting coastlines that even Magellan had never seen. With each new voyage, the Earth became better known, not smaller, but more interconnected, but they were all walking a path Magellan had opened beyond empire and trade. Magellan's voyage also awakened science. Before, geography had been a discipline of assumptions. Now, it became a discipline of data. Sailors no longer guessed at the shape of the continents. They measured, mapped, compared. The need to track time zones, to calculate longitude, and to understand global weather patterns became urgent. The Earth, once distant and divine, became a system, something to be studied, modeled, and, in time, understood. Magellan's journey had shown that the world wasn't unknowable. It was measurable, and if one man could sail around it, then it could be studied, too. But the most powerful change was more subtle. Before Magellan, most people thought in terms of villages, kingdoms, and regions. Their world ended at the coast, or at the edge of the desert. Most had never seen the ocean, let alone dreamed of crossing it. After Magellan, a new concept emerged, that of the global citizen, a person who could be born in one land, live in another, and influence yet another across the sea. The Earth began to feel like a single stage, not a scattered archipelago of isolated worlds, and on that stage, navigation became a kind of power. To move was to know, to map was to claim, and to sail was to change everything. Today, Magellan's name still echoes in surprising places. The Magellan Strait still cuts through the southern tip of South America, its waters cold and slow and filled with stories. The Magellanic Clouds, faint galaxies visible from the southern hemisphere, were named after his voyage. Satellites, GPS systems, and even space missions bear his name. He is remembered not because he was the fastest or the most beloved, but because he was the first. He did not make the world round. He did not shrink the oceans, but he was the first to see it whole, and to risk everything to prove it could be travelled not just imagined. Magellan did not write the ending of his own story. He died partway through, killed on a beach by people defending their home. But his vision survived in the sailors who continued without him, men who might have turned back. But didn't. In that way, his greatest legacy was not simply the route, it was the persistence he instilled. The belief that even if you could not finish the journey, someone else could. That truth was larger than any one life, and that sometimes drawing a new map meant giving up everything to prove the line. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the slow arc of the earth quietly turning beneath stars. Somewhere a sail catches wind. Somewhere else a compass needle quivers. The voyage Magellan began is still with us, not in wooden ships, but in the way we think about the world as something vast, connected, and waiting to be known in the next chapter. We slowed down even further and listened to the voices of those who witnessed it. We returned to Antonio Pigafetta, whose words preserved it all, and to the journals and echoes that tell us how it felt to circle the earth for the first time. Not all voyages are remembered. For every famous expedition, there are 1,000 more that fade into the waves. Men sail, men vanish, and the sea, indifferent, carries on. What saves a voyage from oblivion is not just achievement, but witness. The voyage of Magellan lives on not only because it was first, or daring, or transformative. It lives on because someone wrote it down. Someone watched the stars, the mutinies, the deaths, the kindnesses, and preserved them in ink. That someone was Antonio Pigafetta. Pigafetta was not a sailor, not a soldier. He was a gentleman from Venice, a scholar of languages, maps, and literature. He joined Magellan's fleet as an observer, a servant to the papal ambassador. Yet, over time, he became something more, the keeper of the voyages. Sol. He wrote not just what happened, but how it felt. His journal, later titled Relazione del primo viaggio intorno al mondo, captured the rhythm of life at sea, the lurch of ships in storms, the dryness of salted meat, the fear in men's eyes during mutiny when others lost hope. Pigafetta picked up his quill. Pigafetta was one of only 18 Europeans to return on the Victoria. Though his health was broken, he carried with him hundreds of pages of notes. Drawn from 3 years of hardship and wonder, he had recorded every stop, every island, every tribe encountered. He transcribed words in Tagalog and Malay. He described rituals, dress, belief systems. He mapped coastlines and sketched the faces of strangers. He was an early anthropologist. Centuries before the word existed, he watched as the world grew larger and smaller at once, and through him we see it too. Unlike official royal reports or dry navigational logs, Pigafetta's journal is filled with emotion. He wrote of stars that seemed too far away to be real. He described men dying slowly of hunger, chewing on leather and falling asleep never to wake again. He spoke of the strange peace of the Pacific and the horror of the ambush at Mactan, but he also captured moments of humanity, a sailor learning a native word, a child waving from the shore, a prayer whispered during a storm. His writing reminds us that the voyage was not just a feat, it was a collection of lives, strung together by hardship and hope. Pigafetta's greatest gift may have been his curiosity. Where others saw danger, he saw dialogue. He approached indigenous peoples with questions, not swords. He transcribed languages, asked about customs, observed gestures and clothing and food with fascination. Rather than fear, his was a world of observation, not domination. In doing so, he preserved not just the voyage, but a record of early cultural contact between Europe and the Pacific world, written with unusual empathy and restraint for his time. Without him, many of these first encounters would have been lost after returning to Europe. Pigafetta attempted to publish his journal. He offered it to the Spanish court, to the Pope, to noble patrons. Some were interested, most were not. He was, after all, just one man. It took centuries for his manuscript to find wide recognition, but today it is considered a priceless historical treasure, the most vivid and complete account of the first circumnavigation of the globe, not because it is flawless, but because it is human, because it reads not like a report, but like a memory. Other documents survived as well: ship logs, letters, official royal decrees, and PayPal communications. These confirmed the dates, the cargo, the battles, and the deaths, but they are bones. Pigafetta gave us the flesh. From his writing, we know what Magellan looked like, short and broad-shouldered, with a quiet voice and fierce dignity. We know how the stars reflected off calm waters near the equator. We know the fear that swept through the crew when the strait narrowed, or when fresh fruit was finally found after months of salt, and mold dot through his eyes. We remember. It is easy to forget that history is not made of dates. It is made of stories. Pigafetta understood this. He did not record the voyage only as a chronicle of achievement. He wrote it as a story of endurance, failure, wonder, and grief. He gave voice to the dead. He reminded the future that this was not just a path across the sea, it was a path carved into human lives, and through him we do not simply learn what happened, we feel it. So as you drift into sleep, imagine Pigafetta seated by lantern light on the Victoria, waves rocking the hull gently beneath him. He leans over his journal, writing by candle glow, recording not just what he sees, but what he understands. He does not know if the world will care, but he writes anyway, and because he does, we are still sailing beside him 500 years later. In the final chapter, we bring the journey home, we close the circle, and we say goodbye to the voyage that changed the world forever. Some journeys are straight lines, a point of departure, and a place of arrival. with only distance in between. But this was not one of those journeys. It was a circle, not just around the earth, but around the soul of exploration itself. The voyage Magellan began did not end. When the Victoria dropped anchor in Spain, it ended when we finally understood what had been done, not only that a ship had sailed around the world, but that the world had allowed itself to be known. It had revealed its shape, its breadth, and its silence, and in doing so, it had changed what it meant to be human. Before Magellan's voyage, Earth was still imagined in fragments, distant coasts, disconnected empires, lands shrouded in myth, but after it became a single turning sphere, one that could be measured, crossed, and held, however briefly, in the mind. The voyage didn't shrink the world. It stitched it together. East and west were now just directions, not divisions. Oceans were roads. Continents were no longer final walls, but simply waypoints. What had once been endless became possible, but this truth came at a cost. Of the 270 men who left Spain, most never returned. Some died nameless in foreign sands. Some were buried in waves. Some vanished from history entirely. Even Magellan himself, the man who dreamed the voyage into being, never saw it completed, and yet it was their absence that made the voyage complete. Their sacrifice gave it weight. Their silence gave it meaning. Every revolution comes with gravity. Every circle demands something to be given. Today, most of us will never sail through the Strait of Magellan. We want round the Cape of Good Hope, or count the stars from the deck of a caravel. But we live in the world that those men made real. We fly across oceans in hours. We trade spices, stories, and ideas across hemispheres. The maps on our walls are round, not folded. The clocks in our phones are set to time. Zones created by CIRCUM, navigation. We do not think of it often, but we live inside their wake. The voyage never really ended at its core. This story was not about ships or charts. It was about people. People who believed in something they couldn't yet prove. People who endured loneliness, starvation, betrayal, and awe. People who mutinied and those who forgave them. People who kept journals by candlelight, who wept over saltwater graves, who stared into vast, unbroken horizons and still said, "We go on." That is what makes the voyage eternal. Not the spices, not the glory, but the hearts that beat beneath the sails. Magellan died before knowing what his voyage would become. He did not live to see the Victoria arrive in Spain, or to feel the embrace of triumph. He died on a beach, in a struggle between cultures, believing, perhaps, that he had failed, but history gave him something deeper than applause. It gave him immortality, not for being perfect, but for being first, for seeing the globe whole when others still saw it in halves. He did not finish the journey, but he made it possible, and now, as your eyes grow heavy, return one last time to the image of a quiet ship at sea. The water is calm. The sails are full. The stars wheel overhead in slow silence. You are somewhere between the Pacific and the Indian, somewhere near the curve of the earth. Below deck, men sleep, some with dreams, some with memories, some with nothing but the soft motion of the ship to keep them company. Above, the captain watches the sky, a compass in his hand, a prayer on his breath, the future all around him, and the world turns so now. The story comes to rest from the ports of Seville to the cliffs of South America, from the calm of the Pacific to the chaos of from the Spice Islands to the coast of Africa. The circle is closed. You've sailed with them. You've seen the horizon vanish and returned out, and in your own quiet way, you too have journeyed across the world, not with wind, but with wonder. Good night, traveller. Let the voyage settle into you like calm seas. Let Magellan's dream drift with you into sleep, and let the world, round and endless and waiting, hold you gently in its tide. Until next time, on the Time-Traveling Historian.